Well, there's a third thing he says, and that is, what if they don't believe me? That makes sense. How many of you told somebody something and they say, I just don't believe you, that's crazy. And so Moses shows up. He's been out in the desert. He comes back now 40 years later. He's 80 years old. I mean, imagine an 80-year-old guy coming to you. You and your family have been slaves now for 420 years, and he says, God's going to get you out. God's going to deliver you. We don't believe you. That's crazy. You're just an old guy walking around in the desert. And you remember that Moses had a staff. Now, why would he have a staff? Because old people like to lean on things. Why would he have a staff? Well, for smacking rams. If you've ever been around sheep, those rams sometimes will get cranky, and so you smack them. Anyways, so he has a stick. And so he's standing there, and he's at the burning bush, and his shoes are off, and the sand's coming between his toes. And like, Lord, I don't know your name. Who am I? And then he goes, well, they won't believe me. He says, well, throw down the stick. God, I'm 80 years old. If I throw it down, I'd have to pick it up again. Can you just imagine this guy thinking that? I mean, I can just see it. And so eventually he goes, okay. And so he throws down the stick, and it becomes a snake. And you know what the very next sentence says? It says, and Moses ran. So he turns and he starts running. Hey, if that stick turned into a snake, how many of you would start running right now? I mean, it's just like he starts running. It's just like the natural response, right? He starts to run. Can you see this old guy starting to run? And so God, good thing he didn't, he's 80, he didn't get very far. Anyways, and so God tells him to stop and go back and pick up the snake. Now, listen, if you have ever been around snakes, I grew up in the desert area, so we have rattlesnakes and stuff. And every year I'd have issues with rattlesnakes. And so the one thing you never do with a rattlesnake is pick him up by the tail. And what does God tell him to do? Pick it up by the tail. What happens if you pick up a rattlesnake by the tail? They just wind around and they hit you on the hand. You're going to get bit on the arm. If you're really lucky, you got short arms, you're going to get struck in the face maybe even. So he's like, are you kidding, God? I mean, you just see all this going on in this guy's head, right? And so he's tentative. And he's like, the snake is there. And the snake's slithering. Ooh, yeah, you know how snakes are. And then he reaches down and he picks it up, and it becomes a stick again. And he's like, wow, that was cool. And then he goes, and God says, you know what, here's another thing. I want you to put your hand in your coat. And so he puts his hand in the coat, and he says, he pulls it out, and now it's leprous. And I can't, it's hard for us as Americans to even wrap our minds around the implications of that. I mean, how many of you know that some people have died of COVID? I think on the CDC webpage, it still says that 99.7% of people that have COVID will recover from it. Well, if I could promise you an investment that you would get a 10% return, 99.7% chance of a return, how many of you would take that investment? I would, all right? So the numbers are really, really positive there. So we can't even compare it to COVID. This would be like those who get leprosy, this is a 100% death warrant. There's nothing that can be done. Once you're diagnosed with it, now you're separated from your family. You can never be with your family. There's no 6-foot rule. I mean, this is like you would be walking down the street and you'd be saying, leper, leper, and people would just be moving away from you. You're going to lose the digits of your hand. You're going to end up losing your arm as it spreads. You may lose your nose, your lips, whatever the case. I mean, this is devastating, and there's no cure. And you can just imagine him seeing his hand with leprosy on it and going, this is 100%, I'm dead. And he puts it back into his coat, pulls it out, and you remember, God heals his hand. God gives him a third one. He says, and if they still don't believe you, just take some water, pour it out in the desert. It'll turn to blood there, and so he gives them those three. And so Moses then has one more problem, and that is he's not eloquent. And he just says, God, you say you're the great I am. You say that you're sufficient. You've given me these signs and wonders. But the problem is I'm still not real eloquent. And friends, you and I can make excuse after excuse after excuse not to obey God. But here's the bottom line. You and I need to obey God. And so stop making excuses and obey God. Whatever God's called you to do it with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and all of your mind. Whether it's sharing the gospel with your neighbors, family, friends, or work, co-workers, whatever the case might be. Whatever God's given you, just do it with all of your heart. And don't hold back.